So let's take questions.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible. I think, can we clap? Is that allowed? So
yes, that's a good exercise of your women's autonomy over your body.
And consent.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I am very interested anytime the word autonomy is used. And I'm going to say a lot of random things and some questions and do whatever you want with it. If you want to ignore it, that's fine. But everyone, thanks for listening. So I think that autonomy and this idea of freedom is really interesting and possibly neoliberalist. And in our neoliberalist political context, it's kind of like competition and the individual and freedom and rights and all of these things are valued, and hierarchy seems to be valued, especially in the capitalist context that we're in here in this country. And I think some of those, I mean, there are pros and cons to all of those, maybe not all of those, but some of those. And I think that perhaps it might be helpful to kind of reconceptualize our understanding of liberation or of freedom and autonomy and explore how those are related. And I think that because the first speaker, and where's your name? What's your name? Kate. You were talking about feeling bad that, or I maybe understood that you feel guilty about violating women's autonomy sometimes, and I'm wondering if there's a way we could understand certain like restrictive limits and actions as liberatory, even if on the surface they look like they're anti-choice. Because I think that choice and liberation or freedom are often parallels and coupled and wedded in this culture of neoliberalist capitalist stuff happening here. So maybe is there a way that liberation could be understood in terms of liberation from systems of oppression, and does that mean that these systems of oppression that other speakers have named, like racism and classism, and I'd like to name like ableism and transphobia and stuff, is there a way that, I don't know, something to do with that? I guess like there's a middle way, and I think that that is a radical notion in our black and white society of like wanting one right answer. So just whatever you want to say or ask.
I'd like to briefly address that in terms of, because I feel that I violate women's autonomy as well by accepting court-ordered women into programming on the surface. And again, it's taking that second look and understanding that it's a process, and there are points where we feel like we may not be able to do things in a holistic way, but if we can get bits and pieces with the end goal being one of do no harm, or at least do less harm, with balance and compassion and respect for the human being. And so I feel like I'm moving women through this process where they're coming from the criminal, they've been arrested, they've been to court, they've been jailed, they're coming through this process, and they see me as part of the process. But, and in a way, I guess I am, but I don't want to completely admit to it. But I reconcile that with the fact that I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I want to help them see it too. And that may sound paternalistic, and perhaps it is, but the bigger picture is one of healing, one of if they do come through, if they do have this opportunity, I have seen what comes from that, and also being for them to be in touch with an advocacy organization that can provide them resources and provide another voice. I mean, my calling a probation agent with her permission and saying, you know, it may look like she's doing X, Y, and Z, but you know, she couldn't come to group tonight because he suddenly left to go get some milk. and if she doesn't come to group, that can be a violation of probation. So am I being part of the system, or am I working within the system for change so then she can live an autonomous life and get these people out of her life?
And that sort of do less harm, I think, because in my position, I can't always do no harm, but this idea of doing less harm, I think, is a great way of putting it. And there have been changes in the criminal justice system, particularly in the last 10 years or so on the domestic violence front, in terms of, well, not just domestic violence front, victims in general. There is now a federal law about how we deal with victims and victims' rights. And it really is giving a voice now to victims of crime that they did not have before. It is not perfect by any stretch, but there used to, 10 or 15 years ago, there was no such thing as victim rights. Nobody had that conversation. It certainly was not a part of the federal statute that prosecutors had to follow. And particularly in the crimes against women and children, it really is this sort of community and holistic approach, at least in my office, where we have advocates in the office. And each case that involves violent crime, and particularly violence against women and children, the victims are appointed an advocate, and the advocate is there to make sure that they get the services. We refer them often to organizations like Lisa's, or not so much like yours because we're not working with the defendants, but for the victims, that they get the services they need, whether it be mental health, physical services, housing, because what we often find is there is a much larger problem. I think, as Lisa is pointing out, this is not an isolated incident. It did not happen in a vacuum. Violence rarely is. And if we don't address this whole issue as people are coming in the door, we are going to see the same victims again and again because they are repeat offenders generally, and if the victims don't have resources and services, they often end up stuck in a situation that they don't want to be in. And by offering the advocacy services and the referrals that we offer, it does allow for, in some ways, women to move on into, our victims to move on into other situations. So I think the criminal justice community, at least the prosecutor side, is moving towards this holistic approach. But it's, as always, it's a resource issue, it's a money issue, it's a, half the time there's great organizations doing the work and they're so overworked and they're so stretched and they can't take another body or referral. And so the solution, it is not, it's not a definite one, and it's certainly one that's different for every situation. But I think these communities are working much closer together than they did perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. And there are much stronger lines of communication between the advocacy organizations, the criminal justice system, the probation officers, the law enforcement officers. And I think that is only to the benefit of the victims in these cases.
And along with that, and I don't use the term victim and perpetrator because so often the women I work with are considered to not be, and those are criminal legal system terms. So with what she's talking about, that coordinated community response, the hardest group of people that I can go out and provide a training for are police officers. I lose sleep. I feel physically ill. I am disrespected. It's very challenging, but I do it, and I do it again, and I do it again and again, because if there's even one person whose point of view I can change or slightly influence, there's a bigger picture in this. And for me, this has greatly paid off, that now I have police officers who have my cell phone number and will call me middle of the night and say, you know what, we are at a crime scene and it looks like she's the batterer, and they know how much I hate that term for women, but there must be something we're not asking here or not looking at, so help us understand. So if we go outside of our comfort zones, we have to know ourselves well enough, our politics well enough, feel comfortable with ourselves enough that we can be tolerant of other points of view and form those relationships, have that respect so we can truly meet in the middle. Because it doesn't matter if you don't like that person. How can that person help the people you are working toward? And get the egos, all of that, out of the mix. And the best way that I think you can do that is being authentic and real with people and very tolerant.
Can I follow up on that question and maybe create a little bit of discussion among yourselves? In that I hear from Kate and Lisa, this a very compassionate response to victims, but not a lot of pushback against the institutional structure in which you're working in. And I wondered if you pushed stronger against the parameters that were set up, what would happen to your role, and could you push stronger? Or if you were willing to place yourself out of the job that you are now, is there a way, using your inside expertise, that you could pull apart the system? I mean, I was so struck by the example of trafficked teenagers. They're minors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some don't have housing. I mean, of all the priorities, finding housing versus just the money spent for prosecution, which I assume is enormously expensive. Is there a way to shift those priorities? So number one priority is finding housing and safe space for the teenagers.
I mean, there isn't from my job, because it's sort of different pockets. And so the money that we're putting to prosecution is coming from different funding than what we would need for trafficked youth. Certainly one of the things that's happened is the people in my office who work these cases have been very strong advocates with the community groups that work on this, and we attend event after event and speak again and again and do PowerPoint presentations and lectures and educate the community, and this is important and it's happening here, and really sort of the rallying cry, and that is not on work hours, that people are doing that. That is being out in the community and really getting the word out. So in terms of how we address the victims' issues and how we treat victims in the office, those decisions are certainly on a grassroots case-by-case level. I think each prosecutor can decide how they're going to interact with victims. But in terms of the resources available and what we are going to do when we can't get a victim to cooperate, those decisions are made at a much higher sort of strategic level. And certainly I think I could leave my job and perhaps try to be a part of that conversation. I think I'm more effective. Sophie was talking about she found that some things she was more effective at than others. And I did for a year go work at the FBI in a policy job, and I went to meetings for a year, and I really sucked at it, and I just wanted to get back to my old job. And so I think there's a place for that for people. I am not a policy person, and I think my skills are better used where I'm using them. And truthfully, and I think this is probably pretty common amongst those who are on the panels, we only have so much to give, and there just aren't a lot of people giving. And so someone sort of said to me, have you thought about doing volunteer work? And I was like, are you kidding me? I give at the office 7 days a week. And I get the calls in the middle of the night from the police officers, and my family can attest to, holiday, it doesn't matter. And so I don't have a lot more to give. And I really hope that people will contribute to this cause, and I hope that they will give. And I don't mean that I don't think it's important, but the people who are doing the frontline work, it is hard and it's exhausting, and there are financial sacrifices and emotional sacrifices, and so we need you guys to graduate and join the fight, because it's hard and it's lonely work, and it's hard to be the only one beating the drum, which I think probably everyone in these different fields has often felt, that you're the only one, the sort of one light in the darkness, and not because you are, and I don't mean to be I do such important work, just because it's lonely and it's hard and it's unappreciated, and we need more voices and we need more people to get involved and engaged in this, because a lot of people, with the trafficked youth, how do people not know that? And yet they just don't, despite all of the sort of the work that people have been doing in that field.
Yes.
On that note, since all of you are doing such difficult work, what steps do you take for self-care, and how do you stay happy and healthy people?
You want to start with that one?
Sure. A critical part of my self-care takes place after every group, and that's when the group facilitators and I have 2 other women. One is an intern right now who I facilitate groups with, who I trust completely. And being able to talk and laugh and cry for. Sometimes one of the groups is a night group, so sometimes it goes on real late, is very, very important. Processing that so I don't take it home, because when I take it home, it comes out in all kinds of ways that are just not pretty. And I run, I write. I feel like a big part of my self-care is the writing and the training I do. And I know it's still work on the outside, but for me to feel like the women's voices are not static in that room is incredibly important. And now I'm consulting on this project in Hong Kong. They're building a program there, for better or for worse, for women who are using violence, and they're not court-ordered, and it's based in the sanctity of marriage idea. So for me to be able to take what I know and try to shift things even a little bit is a form of self-care, because it's showing that it's making a difference. So the running, the processing, the work that is outside of but related to the women's voices in that room, and doing my best that when I'm with my family that I am truly present and with my kids and my husband. And that is self-care, but it also takes a tremendous amount of energy.
Yeah, it is. That is a work in progress for me. One of the I don't do child pornography cases anymore, partly because the cost for me was too great. And just to sort of, the self-care issue, it's funny, law enforcement agents who work child pornography cases, they have to get, it's called safeguarding. Every 6 months or so, they go through sort of a counseling session and a check-in and everything. There is no such session for prosecutors.
One counseling session?
Yeah,
After
I think.
6 months?
Right, I know. We don't get anything. So I'm like, this is... And then, like, there's this whole new thing about the poor juries when you go through a child exploitation offense, and that the juries might be traumatized, so they're bringing in counselors for that. And I'm like, they did this for 2 days. Like, you know, like, there isn't that really for some other people working in the field. So there are some choices you have to make, and that was a really hard choice for me, but it was the right choice, and the feeling that in order to continue this work, I couldn't do that kind of work. And I had these homicide prosecutors who are like, I can never do child pornography cases, and I'm like, I can never do homicide cases, and so you kind of find what works for you. I have been really lucky in terms of the people I work with, and that's an incredible resource, because sometimes it is isolating that they're the only people that understand it, but it is also so important to be able to have the conversations with them and be honest with what your feelings are, and not feel, you know, if I articulated that to some people who weren't in this world, then there's this, you know, how could you be so cold-hearted, and you're so callous, and they get it, and they know that these are sort of momentary events and that you can move on. My Smith and my law school friends have been extraordinarily supportive, and there's no way I could do this without them. They check in, they keep tabs, they support my job, and that's a great resource. And certain members of my family, including my brother who's here today, are also just an extraordinary resource. Like the number of crying phone calls he has gotten from me over my job, like particularly in my first year when I would like cry like every time I lost a case, which is a lot when you have domestic violence victims who hate you and won't come to court. And like there would just be nights of me walking back to the courthouse in the dark, like crying on the phone to him and to others who supported me. And that without that, there's no possible way I would be able to sort of get out of bed and fight the fight again and again. And then the other parts, the physical exercise, I'm still working on that stuff. So you have that down much better than I do. But.
So I had an interesting trajectory, because I worked for an organization for several years, and then 7 years ago I started consulting, and so working on my own, and you know, under contract with different organizations, but not being on site most of the time, and so it was definitely more isolating than it had been when I was being kind of held by an organization. And I did start to see slowly that I stopped participating in all kinds of other activities that I used to do in the evenings. You know, I was doing all kinds of activism around different kinds of issues, and I didn't even realize it for a while, but I just started saying no to to participation in all kinds of things that I used to do. And then I started to get it, like, oh, you know, I'm so exhausted and, you know, traumatized a lot of the time from the work that I'm doing on a daily basis in my job, to, then go out and fight another fight in the evening doing the activism that I used to do. And so that gave me pause and made me kind of reassess how to get my needs met around kind of self-care and all that. And I did make important changes, including things like I now swim regularly, and I'm really, really lucky to have an incredible home life, a partner, and family that are just amazing and that make me happy every minute that I'm with them, and that makes a huge difference. Alluded to a little bit in the stuff that I said is that I am now, a good portion of the work that I'm doing is focused on alternatives to the systems that be, and finding new ways to respond to sexual violence. And I've been doing a lot of work in restorative justice and transformative justice, these kind of alternatives to the traditional criminal justice system. And the people that I've hooked up with in those worlds and the conversations that I have, I mean, they're hopeful. And I think that what happens a lot working in this field is that we lose a sense of hope. We start to get really mired in the pain that is generated in people's lives, the ways in which we harm each other and hurt each other, and that's what will kill you. And if you have, the people that might be doing that work too, but that get it, that you have to have hope and you have to be thinking about new frameworks, that is a kind of life-saving measure in doing this work. So it's also kind of the content of the work itself. If you shift it so that it makes more sense for you and that gives you a sense of hope, I think that can really sustain you.